Mrs. Patterson. The stranger standing on my front porch looked nervous. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of a worn brown jacket. He glanced over his shoulder twice before looking back at me. "Are you Loretta Patterson?" I tightened my grip on the doorframe. "Yes." His throat moved as he swallowed. Then he asked a question that stopped my heart. "Have you been looking for your son all these years?" For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The world seemed to go strangely quiet around me. The birds in the maple tree across the street. The distant hum of traffic. Even the wind moving through the leaves. Everything faded. Because only a handful of people knew about my son. And none of them should have known where I lived. Behind the stranger's nervous expression, I could see something else. Recognition. As if he knew a story that had haunted me for more than 50 years. I stared at him. "What did you say?" He reached slowly into his jacket pocket. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. When he pulled out an old photograph, my knees nearly gave way. I knew that picture. I had carried the same photograph in my purse for decades. A little boy, 4 years old, dark hair, bright eyes, a smile that could light up an entire room. My son. The son I had spent my entire life searching for. The son who disappeared when he was just a child. The son I had never stopped loving. The stranger looked down at the photograph before raising his eyes to mine. "I think you should hear my story." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because after 50 years of dead ends, false leads, and broken promises, I had stopped believing miracles were possible. And yet there he stood, holding a photograph that should not have existed. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end. And tell me what city you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story reaches." I never imagined that a quiet Tuesday morning would change everything I thought I knew about my life. At 70 years old, my days followed a simple routine. I woke up before sunrise. Made coffee in the same blue ceramic mug I had used for nearly 20 years. Watered the flowers on my front porch. Then sat by the kitchen window and watched the neighborhood wake up. The little house in Cedar Falls, Iowa wasn't much. Just 2 bedrooms. 1 bathroom. A small backyard with a white fence. But it was peaceful. Peace had become important to me. Because there had been a time when my life was anything but peaceful. There had been a time when every phone call made my heart race. Every knock at the door filled me with hope. Every unfamiliar face in a crowd made me wonder. Could it be him? Could my son finally be coming home? For 50 years, that question had followed me everywhere. Friends told me to move on. Family members stopped bringing it up. Even the detectives eventually retired or passed away. But a mother's heart doesn't work that way. You don't stop looking. You don't stop wondering. And you certainly don't stop loving. Not when a piece of your soul vanished without explanation. That Tuesday morning had started like every other. I was rinsing my coffee cup when the doorbell rang. Nothing unusual about that. Packages arrived. Neighbors occasionally stopped by. But something felt different the moment I opened the door. Because the man standing there wasn't selling anything. He wasn't lost. And he wasn't asking for directions. He was looking directly at me. As though he had spent a very long time trying to find me. And deep inside, before he spoke a single word, I felt a strange certainty. This man had not come to my house by accident. He had come carrying a truth. A truth that would force me to reopen the deepest wound of my life. And before the day was over, I would learn that everything I believed about my son's disappearance was wrong. After inviting the stranger inside, I led him to my small kitchen. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The old coffee maker hummed softly on the counter. Morning sunlight spilled across the worn oak table where I had eaten breakfast alone for nearly 15 years. The stranger placed the photograph carefully in front of him. I couldn't stop looking at it. That little face had followed me through every stage of my life. Every birthday, every Christmas, every Mother's Day, every year that passed without answers. "My name is Daniel," the stranger finally said. I nodded politely, but my attention remained fixed on the photograph. Because before I could hear whatever story he had brought to my doorstep, my mind was already drifting backward. Back to the life I had lived after my son disappeared. People often imagine that grief is loud. They imagine tears, breakdowns, sleepless nights. The truth is usually quieter than that. The hardest part wasn't losing my son. The hardest part was waking up every morning afterward and continuing to live. For years, I worked 2 jobs. During the day, I cleaned offices at the county courthouse. In the evenings, I stocked shelves at a grocery store outside town. I wasn't building a retirement fund. I wasn't saving for vacations. Every extra dollar went toward one thing: finding my son. Private investigators, travel expenses, missing person organizations, newspaper advertisements, age-progressed photographs. I spent thousands of dollars chasing possibilities that never led anywhere. One tip would come from Texas, another from Arizona. Sometimes someone would swear they had seen a young man who looked exactly like the child in my photographs. Every lead carried hope. Most ended in disappointment. I learned not to celebrate too early. I learned not to tell people when I was investigating a new possibility. Because after enough dead ends, you stop wanting to explain your heartbreak to others. My husband, Frank, tried his best. For a long time, he searched beside me. We attended meetings together, talked to detectives together, sat awake at night discussing possibilities. But grief changes people. Some couples grow closer. Others slowly drift apart. Frank never stopped loving our son. But eventually, he stopped believing we would find him. I never could. That difference created a distance neither of us knew how to bridge. When Frank passed away 8 years ago, the house became quieter than I thought possible. After the funeral, people returned to their lives. The sympathy cards stopped arriving. The phone stopped ringing. And I was left alone with my memories. Most evenings, I sat by the living room window with a cup of tea and an old photo album. Page after page. Pictures of birthday parties, baseball games, family picnics, snapshots of a little boy smiling into the camera. A little boy frozen in time while the rest of us kept growing older. There were days when I wondered if he was still alive. Days when guilt weighed heavier than hope. Had I missed something? Had I made a mistake all those years ago? Could I have prevented what happened? Those questions never truly leave a mother. They simply become part of her. Daniel listened quietly as I spoke. His expression never changed. He never interrupted. When I finally stopped talking, the kitchen fell silent again. Then he reached into a leather folder he had carried with him. Slowly, he removed another photograph. This one was newer, much newer. My heart began to pound. Because the man in the picture looked familiar. Not familiar like a stranger. Familiar like someone I had known my entire life. Someone whose face I had imagined growing older thousands of times. Daniel slid the photograph across the table. Then he looked directly into my eyes. And for the second time that morning, my world shifted beneath my feet. "I think," he said quietly, "you need to see this before I tell you the rest." I stared at the photograph for what felt like an eternity. The man in the picture looked to be in his early 50s. Dark hair, touched with grey around the temples. Broad shoulders. Strong jawline. Kind eyes. Those eyes stopped me cold. Because I had seen him before. Not in a photograph. Not in a mirror. But in the face of a little boy who used to run through my backyard chasing fireflies on summer evenings. My hands began to tremble. "Who is this?" I asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he folded his hands together on the table. His expression was careful, almost nervous. "As strange as this sounds," he said quietly, "that's the reason I came here." The kitchen suddenly felt smaller. The walls seemed to close in around me. I looked from the photograph to Daniel and back again. For 50 years, I had lived with uncertainty. Now uncertainty was sitting across from me drinking my coffee. "What do you know?" I asked. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Not enough. At least not yet." That answer frustrated me more than I expected. For decades, people had approached me with fragments, rumors, possibilities, stories that sounded convincing until they fell apart. I wasn't interested in another mystery. I wanted facts. "I think you should start from the beginning," I said. Daniel nodded. Then he reached into his folder again. This time he pulled out several documents. Not official papers. Copies. Printouts. Old photographs. Notes. The kind of collection someone builds over many years. "I didn't come here by accident, Mrs. Patterson." His voice was calm. "I've been trying to find you for almost 6 months." I felt a chill run through me. Why? Because someone told me a story. I waited. My father told me. For a second, neither of us spoke. "My father?" I repeated. Daniel nodded. "Before he died last year, he gave me a box." He looked down at the folder. There were photographs inside, letters, newspaper clippings, notes he had kept for decades. I felt my stomach tighten. "What kind of notes?" Daniel swallowed. "The kind written by a man carrying a secret." The words settled heavily between us. Outside, a lawn mower started somewhere down the street. A dog barked in the distance. Ordinary sounds. An ordinary morning. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. "My father never explained everything," Daniel continued. "But shortly before he passed away, he told me there was a woman in Iowa who deserved answers." My chest tightened. "He mentioned me. Not your name at first." Daniel shook his head. "Just pieces." He opened one of the folders. Inside was a yellowed newspaper clipping. The paper looked decades old. The photograph printed beside the article made my breath catch. It was me, much younger, holding a picture of my missing son during a press conference nearly 50 years earlier. I hadn't seen that article in decades. Daniel gently slid it toward me. "My father kept this all these years." I stared at it. Why would a stranger keep something like that? Why would a man hundreds of miles away save newspaper articles about my family? The question made my skin prickle. Because deep down, I already knew the answer. People don't keep secrets for 50 years unless they're connected to them. Daniel seemed to read the fear on my face. "I don't think my father took your son," he said softly. "But I do think he knew something." The room fell silent. I looked down at the photograph of the middle-aged man again. The resemblance was impossible to ignore now. The eyes, the smile, even the way he tilted his head. For the first time in decades, a thought entered my mind that I had never allowed myself to believe. What if my son hadn't disappeared forever? What if someone had spent 50 years making sure he stayed hidden? And if that was true, who else knew? After Daniel left that afternoon, I didn't turn on the television. I didn't make dinner. I didn't even finish the cup of coffee that had gone cold beside me hours earlier. Instead, I sat alone in my living room with the folder spread across my coffee table. The same folder Daniel had left behind. The same folder that was forcing me to revisit memories I had spent decades trying to survive. Outside, the Iowa sun slowly disappeared behind the trees. The house grew darker, but I barely noticed. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about where my son might be. I was thinking about the people who had been around me when he disappeared. The people I trusted. The people I never questioned. A strange feeling settled in my chest. Not hope. Not fear. Suspicion. I stood up and walked to the hallway closet. On the top shelf sat an old cardboard box. The corners were worn. The tape had yellowed with age. I hadn't opened it in nearly 10 years. Inside were photographs, police reports, newspaper clippings, letters, the remains of a mother's search. I carried the box to the dining room table and began sorting through everything again. Slowly, carefully, the way detectives do when they're looking for something everyone else missed. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The same reports, the same witness statements, the same unanswered questions. Then I found a photograph I hadn't looked at in years. It showed a neighborhood picnic held a few months before my son disappeared. Families sat on folding chairs. Children played baseball in the background. Everyone looked happy, normal. But as I studied the image, one face caught my attention. A man standing near the edge of the crowd. I recognized him immediately. Harold Mercer. A family friend. At least that's what I had always called him. Harold had known my husband for years. He attended barbecues, holiday gatherings, birthday parties. He was around often enough that no one questioned his presence. I stared at his face for a long time. Then another memory surfaced. A conversation I hadn't thought about in decades. Just weeks before my son disappeared, Harold had stopped by unexpectedly. I remembered standing in the kitchen while he drank coffee with my husband. At the time, nothing seemed strange. But now certain details felt different. Too different. Harold had asked unusual questions. Questions about our schedule. Questions about school. Questions about where my son spent his afternoons. Back then, I assumed he was making conversation. Now I wasn't so sure. The memory left a knot in my stomach. I continued searching through the box. More photographs. More reports. Then another detail emerged. Harold's name appeared more than once. Not in police reports. Not officially. But in my own handwritten notes. Small reminders I'd written during the early years of the investigation. One note simply read, Harold said he saw Tommy near the river. Another, Harold called after midnight. Strange. I sat back in my chair. The house was completely silent. For 50 years, I had believed my son's disappearance was a tragedy. A random event. A terrible accident. Now another possibility was taking shape. What if it wasn't random at all? What if someone close to us knew more than they admitted? I looked again at the newspaper clipping Daniel's father had saved all those years. Then I looked at Harold's photograph. A chill ran through me. Because for the first time, two separate pieces of my past were beginning to connect. And the more I thought about it, the more one question refused to leave my mind. If Harold knew something, why had he spent the rest of his life pretending he didn't? I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same three faces. My son, Daniel, and Harold Mercer. By sunrise, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad in front of me. For years, I had waited for answers to find me. Now, for the first time in decades, I decided to go looking for them myself. The old clock above the stove read 7:15 a.m. I poured a cup of coffee and opened the folder again. The more I studied the papers, the more uneasy I felt. Not because of what was there, because of what wasn't. Entire sections of my son's case seemed incomplete. Important dates had gaps. Witness statements stopped abruptly. Several follow-up reports appeared to be missing altogether. I had never noticed it before. Or maybe I had trusted the system too much to question it. By 8 o'clock, I was dressed and heading into town. My first stop wasn't the police station. It was the county records office. The same building I had visited dozens of times during the first years after my son's disappearance. The building looked smaller now. Older. The brick exterior was faded from decades of Iowa winters. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and dust. A young clerk greeted me with a polite smile. I explained that I was researching an old family matter. She directed me to the archives department. Most of the records from that period had been digitized years ago. But not everything. Some files still existed only in storage. I spent nearly 3 hours reviewing documents. Property records. Local directories. Archived newspaper articles. Most of it led nowhere. Then I found something. A property record from 1976. The year after my son disappeared. The address belonged to Harold Mercer. That wasn't unusual. What caught my attention was a second name listed on the paperwork. A woman named Eleanor Brooks. I had never heard that name before. Yet, according to the records, she had jointly owned a small farmhouse with Harold for nearly 7 years. The discovery bothered me immediately. Because Harold had always claimed he lived alone. I remembered that clearly. In fact, everyone in town believed he lived alone. I copied the record and slipped it into my folder. Then I kept digging. Another hour passed. Eventually I found an old voter registration document. The same woman. The same address. Again and again, her name appeared alongside Harold's. Someone had been sharing his life for years. Someone no one ever talked about. When I finally returned to my car, the afternoon sun was high overhead. My head ached from staring at records all day. But I couldn't stop thinking about Eleanor Brooks. Who was she? And why had Harold hidden her existence from everyone? Back home, I spread the copies across my dining room table. The pieces didn't fit together yet. Not completely. But a picture was starting to form. A hidden woman. A secret property. A family friend who asked too many questions before my son disappeared. Then I remembered something Daniel had said. My father carried this secret for decades. At the time, I assumed he meant a single event. Now I wasn't so sure. Secrets like this aren't usually built overnight. They grow slowly. One lie at a time. One hidden detail at a time. As evening settled over the house, I reached for the phone. There was one more person I needed to speak with. Someone who had known Harold longer than almost anyone. Someone who was still alive. Someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly 20 years. I dialed the number from memory. To my surprise, she answered on the second ring. And after I introduced myself, the silence on the other end told me something immediately. She already knew exactly why I was calling. I recognized the voice immediately. Margaret Dawson. She was 83 now. A retired school secretary who had lived in Cedar Falls longer than almost anyone I knew. Back when my son disappeared, Margaret seemed to know everything happening in town. Not because she was nosy. Because people trusted her. They talked to her. Confided in her. And somehow, information always found its way to Margaret. Loretta, she said quietly. I wondered if you'd ever call about this. Those words sent a chill through me. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. What do you mean? There was a long pause. Long enough that I almost thought the call had disconnected. Then Margaret sighed. The truth is, I hoped I was wrong. My heart began to pound. Wrong about what? About Harold. Outside, evening shadows stretched across my backyard. Inside, the kitchen suddenly felt very still. Margaret's voice grew softer. People always thought Harold was a lonely man. I glanced at the records spread across the table. Eleanor Brooks. Another pause. So you found her? The way she said it told me everything. Margaret knew exactly who Eleanor was. Who was she? I asked. His sister. I blinked. His sister? For a moment, I was too surprised to speak. Harold had a sister living with him for years. A sister almost no one knew existed. Why would he hide that? Margaret gave a sad laugh. Because Eleanor wasn't supposed to be there. The answer only confused me more. What does that mean? Margaret hesitated. When she spoke again, her voice sounded older. Tired. As far as the town knew, Eleanor moved away in the late 60s. I waited. She didn't. The silence that followed seemed to fill the entire room. Harold told everyone she left. Margaret continued. But she stayed on that farmhouse outside town for years. I looked down at the documents again. The hidden property. The hidden woman. The hidden life. Nothing about it made sense. Until Margaret said something that changed everything. Eleanor worked with children. I froze. What kind of work? She used to help at a private care facility outside Waterloo. My stomach tightened. A care facility. Children. Hidden identities. The words began connecting themselves in ways I didn't like. Margaret must have heard the change in my breathing. Loretta, I'm not saying your son was there. But after he disappeared, there were rumors. The room felt colder. What rumors? That Harold suddenly became very protective of that property. I stared out the kitchen window. The sun had almost disappeared now. Darkness settled over the neighborhood. He stopped visitors. He stopped attending community events. And for several years, hardly anyone saw Eleanor at all. I swallowed hard. The timeline matched too closely. Far too closely. For 50 years I had believed my son's disappearance was an unsolved tragedy. Now it felt different. Now it felt like a secret. A secret carefully protected by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Margaret was quiet for several seconds. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. There was one more thing. I gripped the phone tighter. What? About 6 months after your son disappeared, I saw Harold with a little boy. My heart nearly stopped. The room disappeared around me. All I could hear was Margaret's voice. I only saw them for a few seconds. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Because deep down, I already knew what question was coming next. And I wasn't sure I was ready to hear the answer. That little boy, Margaret whispered, looked exactly like your son. I didn't sleep at all that night. Margaret's words kept replaying in my mind. I saw Harold with a little boy. He looked exactly like your son. For 50 years, I had imagined thousands of possibilities. Runaways. Accidents. Mistaken identities. Even miracles. But never this. Never the possibility that someone close to our family had known more than they admitted. The next morning, I called Daniel. He answered immediately. Almost as if he had been waiting. I need to see everything your father left behind, I said. There was a brief silence. Then he replied quietly. I think it's time. 2 hours later, I was sitting across from him in a small office he rented above a hardware store in Waterloo. The room wasn't much. A desk. 2 chairs. Several filing cabinets. But what sat on the desk caught my attention immediately. A cardboard box. Old. Worn. The same kind of box people use to store things they don't want anyone else to find. Daniel rested his hand on the lid. This is what my father left me. My pulse quickened. Slowly, he opened it. Inside were dozens of folders. Photographs. Letters. Receipts. Maps. Names. Dates. Years of records. Someone had spent a very long time collecting information. The first hour passed in near silence. We sorted documents one at a time. Most seemed unrelated. Old utility bills. Property tax records. Personal notes. Then I found a small spiral notebook. The cover was faded. The pages brittle with age. Inside were handwritten entries. Some were ordinary. Weather notes. Appointments. Phone numbers. Then I reached an entry dated October 14th, 1975. 3 months after my son disappeared. The handwriting read, "Eleanor says the boy is adjusting better than expected." I stopped breathing. For several seconds, I simply stared at the page. The boy. Not a boy. The boy. Specific. Deliberate. Important enough to record. I looked up at Daniel. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. Both of us understood what we were reading. My hands shook as I turned the page. Several months later, another entry appeared. Moved him again. Safer this way. My stomach tightened. Moved him where? Why? And from whom? Page after page revealed fragments. Never full explanations. Never direct admissions. Just enough information to suggest something terrible had been hidden. Then I found the entry that changed everything. A single sentence. Written in darker ink than the others. As if the writer wanted to remember it. The mother must never know. I stared at those words until they blurred. The mother. Me. There was no doubt in my mind. The room suddenly felt too warm. Too small. Too crowded. For 50 years, I had blamed myself. Questioned every decision. Wondered if I had failed my son somehow. Now another possibility stood before me. Someone had intentionally kept us apart. Someone had made choices on our behalf. Choices neither of us ever agreed to. Daniel sat quietly across the desk. Then he reached into the bottom of the box. There is one more thing. He removed a sealed envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. My name was written across the front. Not typed. Written. In careful handwriting. Loretta Patterson. My hands trembled as I accepted it. I had never seen the envelope before. Yet something about it felt familiar. Almost personal. Daniel looked at me carefully. My father never opened it. I turned the envelope over. The seal was still intact. Untouched for decades. Whatever was inside had been waiting a very long time to be read. And deep down, I already knew. The answers I had searched for my entire life were finally within reach. I just wasn't sure I was ready for them. I didn't sleep that night. Not even for a minute. The letter sat on my kitchen table long after midnight. The words refused to leave me. Your son was told his mother had died. I must have read that sentence 20 times. Maybe more. For 50 years, I had lived with one unbearable thought. That somewhere out there, my son might believe I had stopped looking. Now I faced something worse. He may have believed I never wanted him at all. The house felt different that night. Smaller. Quieter. The old refrigerator hummed softly in the corner. Rain tapped against the kitchen window. And I sat alone at the table staring at a life that had been stolen by a lie. A lie told to a child. A lie that grew larger every year. At 3 in the morning, I pulled out an old photo album. Page after page. Birthdays. Christmas mornings. Baseball uniforms. A little boy smiling at the camera. I wondered how many times he had looked in the mirror and wondered where he came from. I wondered if he ever felt different. If some small part of him always sensed something was missing. By sunrise, the sadness had changed. Not disappeared. Changed. Grief became determination. I could not recover 50 years. But I could still recover the truth. And this time, I would do it correctly. With records. With evidence. With facts nobody could deny. The next morning, I called Daniel. Then I called an attorney. The search was no longer about finding clues. The search was about proving what happened. And for the first time in decades, I felt closer to my son than ever before. The investigation took longer than I expected. Weeks, not days. At 70 years old, patience had become familiar. But that didn't make waiting any easier. Rebecca Collins began reviewing every document connected to the case. Property records, guardianship filings, archived court records, old adoption paperwork. Some had been sealed for decades. Others had been misplaced. Several required formal requests before anyone could access them. Meanwhile, Daniel continued organizing the materials left behind by his father. Every few days, another small piece surfaced. A receipt. A note. A date that matched Eleanor's letter. None of it proved everything. But together, the pieces began forming a picture. One evening, nearly 6 weeks after our first meeting, Rebecca called. Her voice sounded different. Careful. Measured. The way people sound when they know they're carrying life-changing news. We found a legal connection. I sat down immediately. A guardianship filing. A name change request. And a trail that led to a family in Cedar Rapids. For the first time, the story existed outside memories and letters. It existed on paper. Official paper. The kind that survives generations. That night, I sat on my porch watching the sun disappear beyond the trees. 50 years. The truth had been buried for 50 years. And now it was finally starting to surface. Several more weeks passed. Rebecca's team located the man connected to the records. At first, he was cautious. Who could blame him? A stranger was suddenly claiming to know something about his childhood. Something that could change everything. Rebecca approached him carefully. No pressure. No demands. Only facts. Documents. Records. Questions. To everyone's surprise, he agreed to speak. Then he revealed something unexpected. For years, he had suspected parts of his past didn't add up. Certain documents were missing. Stories changed depending on who told them. Family conversations often ended when he entered the room. Small things, but enough to leave questions behind. Eventually, he agreed to a DNA test. Then we waited. 3 more weeks. The longest 3 weeks of my life. When the results finally arrived, Rebecca invited Daniel and me to her office. I already knew what my heart believed. But belief and proof are not the same thing. The report confirmed everything. Probability of biological relationship, 99.998%. I stared at the page for a long time. 50 years of uncertainty ended in a single sentence. My son was alive. The mystery was over. But another journey was about to begin. Because finding him wasn't the same as knowing him. And neither of us knew what would happen next. The meeting didn't happen immediately. And honestly, I'm glad it didn't. Both of us needed time. Time to absorb the truth. Time to process 50 years of missing pieces. Rebecca acted as a bridge between us. Over several weeks, messages were exchanged. Questions were answered. Photographs were shared. Slowly, cautiously, two strangers began learning about each other. Then one afternoon, Rebecca called. "I think he's ready." 3 simple words. Yet my hands trembled when I heard them. The meeting was arranged for the following Saturday. Neutral ground. Private. No cameras. No reporters. No dramatic surprises. Just 2 people connected by blood and separated by time. When I entered the conference room, he was already there, standing near the window, looking nervous. To my surprise, so was I. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled politely, and something inside me shifted. Not because he looked exactly like the little boy I remembered. Because he didn't. He looked like a man who had lived an entire life. A husband. A father. A grandfather. A man with his own memories, struggles, and victories. When he finally sat down, he looked directly at me. Then he asked a question so simple it nearly broke my heart. What was I like as a little boy? Not who took him. Not who lied. Not who hid the truth. He wanted to know who he had been. And for the next several hours, I told him everything. For the first time in 50 years, a mother was finally telling her son his own story. For a long moment, I simply looked at him. My son. The words still felt unreal. For 50 years, I had imagined this moment. Sometimes he was still a little boy. Sometimes he was a young man walking through my front door. Sometimes he didn't recognize me at all. But reality was quieter than any dream I had ever created. Tommy sat across from me waiting for an answer. Not demanding. Not angry. Just searching. The same way I had searched for most of my life. I reached into my purse and removed the photograph I had carried for decades. The edges were worn. The colors faded. But the memory remained clear. I placed it beside the photograph he had brought. The 2 pictures were identical. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled. A small smile. The same smile from the birthday pictures. The same smile I remembered from before everything changed. And suddenly, 50 years disappeared. Not completely. Not enough to erase the pain. But enough to remind me that some connections survive even the longest separation. We spent hours talking that day. About his childhood. His adoptive parents. His family. His career. His children. My grandchildren. Grandchildren I never knew existed. Every answer brought new emotions. Joy. Sadness. Regret. Gratitude. Life had moved forward for both of us. We couldn't recover the birthdays we missed. The holidays. The school graduations. The ordinary afternoons that families take for granted. Those years were gone. Nothing could change that. But something surprised me. Neither of us spent much time talking about blame. The truth mattered. The documents mattered. The lies mattered. But they no longer controlled the future. Eventually, Tommy asked the question I knew was coming. Do you hate the people who did this? I thought carefully before answering. For many years, I believed finding the truth would bring anger. Revenge. Some kind of victory. Instead, it brought something else. Peace. I looked out the office window for a moment before answering. No. He seemed surprised. I smiled softly. I spent too many years losing time. I don't want to spend whatever time I have left losing more. The room became quiet again. Then Tommy reached across the table. For the first time since we met, he took my hand. Neither of us said anything. We didn't need to. Some moments are bigger than words. A few months later, Tommy visited my home in Cedar Falls. Then he came again. And again. Eventually, his wife came too. Then the grandchildren. The little house that had once felt so empty slowly filled with life. Laughter returned. Photographs returned. Family returned. One spring afternoon, nearly a year after Daniel first knocked on my door, I sat on my porch watching my grandchildren play in the backyard. The sun was warm. The flowers were blooming. Tommy stood near the fence helping one of the children throw a baseball. For a moment, he looked exactly like the little boy I remembered. And I realized something important. The greatest miracle wasn't that I found my son. The miracle was that hope survived long enough for us to find each other. For 50 years, I searched for answers. In the end, I found something better. I found my family. And for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't looking for anything anymore.